Hello and welcome to the second CPD session on the topic of adaptive teaching. Today we are focusing on scaffolding. We all know scaffolding is essential, and the aim of today is to give you some practical tools to include in your own teaching practice. As a reminder, each of the sessions this year will link to adapting one of the EEF 5-a-day principles. These are the aspects of high quality teaching which benefit all students, including those with SEND. Good SEND teaching is good teaching for all, and adaptations should not be limited to SEND students. Last time, we looked at explicit instruction, which includes scaffolding, but today is entirely dedicated to Principle 3, scaffolding. Before we start, you have a do now task to complete to test your recall. In the last session, we looked at Rosenshine's principles. For our retrieval task today, I'm going to ask you to fill in the blanks. Sometimes the blanks represent a word, sometimes a phrase or clause, sometimes a visual. For the final box, you will need to recall another of Rosenshine's principles, including the title, the visual that accompanies it, and the description. You have 5 minutes to do this with the person next to you. Pause here. All 10 of Rosenshine's principles of instruction are now on the screen for you to self-assess against. Consider which principles you struggled to recall. Why do you think those were challenging? What would have helped you to recall this principle? Today we are going to dig deeper into the principle of scaffolding. Consider the metaphor. Why do we use the term scaffolding? Scaffolding is a metaphor for temporary support that is removed when no longer required. It may be visual, verbal, or written. Temporary is a key word here. We're aiming for our students to be independent learners. Scaffolding offers that support to help them get there. Last time, we looked at some examples of scaffolding, and you created mind maps to showcase your own examples. As a reminder, here are some examples of visual scaffolds. A task planner, a list of the steps a pupil needs to take, model examples of work, or images that support vocabulary learning. Written scaffolds can include a word bank, a writing frame, or sentence starters. Verbal scaffolds include phrases such as, let's look at this together. What have you done before that will help you with this task? Or, don't forget, your work needs to include. We're now going to look at verbal scaffolding more closely through the EEF's scaffolding triangle. This framework was originally designed to support LSAs to encourage pupil independence, but schools have used this more widely as an approach for all adults to verbally scaffold pupil learning. The nearer the top, the greater the pupil independence. The initial expectation is that pupils self-scaffold. Adults should then intervene appropriately when pupils demonstrate that they're unable to proceed, and they move down the layers in turn. So, first, the adults give time for the pupils to self-scaffold, whilst the adult observes, gives processing time, and allows the pupil to problem solve. If support is needed, the adult will then prompt with, what do you need to do first? What's your plan? Or offering encouragement. If further support is needed, drop down to cluing with prompts like, remember when we, or could you use? If this isn't successful, model the task whilst articulating your thoughts out loud. Finally, if it's needed, correct the student and then model how the answer was achieved as a worked example. This ensures that students have the right level of support, and it's particularly helpful when pupils can't articulate what they're struggling with, telling you, I don't get it, but not being able to give you any more information than that. You can start with prompting, then cluing, then modelling, then correcting if it gets that far. This is a scaffold that requires little or no preparation, but can be really effective in developing independent learners. I'm going to give you time to have a discussion in groups. To what extent would teachers or LSAs benefit from this more structured approach to verbal scaffolding in your school? You have 5 minutes. Pause here. I'm now going to speak about how worked examples can be scaffolded to support learning. Worked examples are a form of modelling, providing pupils with a step-by-step demonstration of a task. The FAME approach details 4 strategies that can be used separately or in combination to support learning. The first is fading, so gradually removing steps from your examples so that pupils can take over more of the thinking themselves. The next is alternating, so that's switching between a worked example and asking pupils to try a similar task so they can immediately apply what they've seen. The third method is mistakes, so using examples that contain deliberate or common errors so that pupils can learn to identify, diagnose, and correct misconceptions. And the final strategy is explanation. Model your thinking out loud so learners understand how and why each step in your worked example is used, but also inviting them to self-explain. Let's look at that in more detail. Fading describes the process of gradually reducing and removing elements of full worked examples. I've given you an example of fading on the right-hand side of the screen. This relates to a Key Stage 2 English lesson on fronted adverbials. The first sentence is a full worked example. At dawn, the old lighthouse creaked in the wind. The teacher would provide this sentence, thinking aloud about the conventions as to why this is a correct example of a fronted adverbial in a sentence. As a partial scaffold, the teacher could then provide the fronted adverbial at dawn and then ask the students to finish that sentence. If they wanted to challenge the students further, they could then just give the structure of the sentence. In the example, they've given the fact that it needs to be a time adverbial at the beginning of the sentence, followed by a comma, and then the main clause. Once students have had this experience, they're then able to move on to independent practice. Alternation. Rather than using a collection of worked examples together at the beginning of the lesson, alternate these with opportunities for pupils to complete a similar problem using an I do, you do format. Once pupils have developed confidence, add variation or additional complexity to the examples, then repeat the cycle. Mistakes. Once pupils have developed a good understanding of the topic, including mistakes in the worked examples can provide further challenge. Supporting pupils to explain why incorrect solutions are wrong can help them to develop a deeper understanding than when they solely consider the correct solutions. An awareness of the confidence and competency of your pupils is vital. Introducing incorrect worked examples too early can embed misconceptions. On the right-hand side, you'll see some examples of mistakes of varying complexity that relate to that fronted adverbials lesson that I introduced 2 slides back. Explanation. To help pupils understand how and why the worked example has been used, initially teachers should model their thinking using a think aloud process. This can involve completing the worked example verbally, describing how and why they are tackling each stage of the problem. Pupils should also be encouraged to reflect on the worked example and explain to themselves why each step has been used, helping them to make sense of the modelled solution. Explanation prompts or peer-to-peer explanation can facilitate this. For your next task, I'd like you to use this prompt to create a skeleton plan of a lesson that includes components of the FAME approach and trial this lesson in the next couple of weeks. Remember, you do not need to use all components within one lesson, but instead use your knowledge of the class and where you are within your sequence of learning to judge which components will be helpful for your pupils. You have 15 minutes. Pause here. For your final task today, I'd like you to critically review a lesson clip. I'd like you to consider what methods does the teacher use to scaffold the learning? Are these methods visual, verbal, written, or a mix? Which elements of FAME did the teacher apply? And from what you've seen within that lesson clip, how could the scaffolding within the lesson be improved? For your next steps from the training today, please teach the lesson that you have planned and reflect on the impact of the technique you used. Also, consider the implications for the scaffolding triangle in your school or within your class. Thank you for your engagement today.